Hi everyone, this is Callie. Thanks so much for being here. I'm excited to share today's fall card with you. It's so fun and colorful because I got to play with Nuvo Shimmer Powders for the very first time. These powders are not new and have been around for years, so I am just now getting acquainted with them. So I'm using the Pumpkin to Talk About set. This set is a 6x8 stamp set with a 6x6 cling of the pumpkin background with lots of great sentiments. And the die set that comes with it will cut out the sentiments as well as create frames for the sentiments as well. So to begin, I am using Distress Watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to prep that with my powder tool because we're going to be embossing this with gold embossing powder. I'm embossing for two specific reasons. One, because I really want the pretty pumpkins to show up in the background, and gold is just a great accent, especially when pumpkins are traditionally oranges and yellows. So the gold is a great complement for the pumpkins. But then also because I'm using this new medium, I'm not sure how the colors are going to spread, so that embossing line really helps keep the pigment contained to a certain area. So after adding the gold embossing powder and heat setting it, I'm going to be playing with these 5 Nuvo Shimmer Powder colors. I'm using Catherine Wheel, which is this red, and then I'm also using Sunday Rosette, Falling Leaves, Green Parade, and Violet Brocade. So this being my very first time, I thought it would be safest of me to lay down a wash of color over the pumpkins, then sprinkle the shimmer powders on top, and then spread it out with some more water on a wet brush. So that's what my process is for this card. I know there are so many other different ways you can play with this pigment. You can also add it to dry paper and then add water. I like the way the shimmer and the different pigments in these powders will spread on their own, so I like this organic look. Plus, you'll notice that in a particular bottle there are different speckles of color, and I don't want to move it around too much because I really want those speckles of color to show through. So on this second pumpkin, I laid down a wash of water, and then I'm adding some yellow pigment as well as some green pigment, and then moving it around, letting it blend together naturally, and then just leaving it as is. It looks kind of messy, but it's kind of like no-line watercoloring for me. If I want to control the process and think that it's too messy, then I'll give up on myself. So I decided to just go with it and play and let it do its thing. So this is me letting go of a little bit control, but also controlling the process by isolating each of the pumpkins and working on them one at a time. If you were working on a background with, say, just a pattern, then you can really wet the whole entire surface and just go to town with the powder, sprinkling it on and letting it do its thing and letting it dry and having this really organic background. But again, this is me trying to control where I want the colors while trying to give it that organic look as well. So play with it how you want. Grab some and try it. This is, again, my first time, so this is me playing for you, and I hope you like how it turns out, because while it's a different kind of card for me, I really enjoyed the process and being able to play with a new medium. So I am just getting through the pumpkins on this panel, and I'm skipping around to make sure that no two pumpkins are adjacent to each other with the same color palette. And I'm also playing with the mixtures of two different pigments, like with this one, yellow and red together, to get them to blend into an orange. So I'm not showing that I am laying down a wash of water first, but that is what I'm doing before I lay down the pigment. Now you can always apply the pigment directly to the paper, then add water, like I said initially. So it's just however you want to do it. And I am just going to finish up here with these last few colors. I know that I don't need to cover the full 6x6 panel because I'm going to be cutting this down, but I want to make sure that I don't have any uncolored areas. So I'm just trying to be safe here and just coloring as much as I can, but not going all the way to the top. So this is the last pumpkin that I'm going to color, and I don't have a shimmer powder in brown, so I'm going to pull in some watercolor here. It's just a basic brown color, and I'll apply that to the stems of the pumpkins. And because they're embossed, the embossed areas are going to repel that pigment and water. So I do have to jump around a little bit. As it dries, I can go back to it and then add a little bit more pigment like I'm doing right now on this second round of color. So when I'm done adding all of the brown, this panel is ready to go, so I'm going to set it aside because there are a few other things that I want to do. I want to die cut a sunflower as well as some foliage. So I'm also using distress watercolor cardstock here, and I'm flooding the area with water so that I can add the shimmer powder and watercolor it. So here again, I'm adding shimmer powder and letting it spread a little bit and kind of moving the pigment around with my wet watercolor brush. I do add a little bit more pigment because I wanted those speckles to kind of come through. That just makes the petals a bit more interesting in color. And then for the brown, I'm going to use my watercolor pan and just add a round piece for the center of the sunflower. And then moving on to the foliage, I'm using two different greens here of the shimmer powder. I love the way these two colors blend together. The speckles in the darker color are really interesting, and it really lends to the texture of the leaves after it's die cut. I have some leftover white paint on an acrylic block here that I'm just going to re-wet. And then I'll splatter all three panels with the white paint, and I'll do the same with some brown watercolor as well. I know some people don't like splatter, but I'm all about the texture, and I really think it creates a lot of interest on a card, so I always do it. But of course, if it's not your thing, you can always opt to leave that part out of your project. Okay, so now all of my watercolor panels are done. I'm going to use the sunflower die and the foliage dies to die cut those parts out. Next, for the pumpkin background, I have this stitched rectangle frame, and I'm just moving it around my background to see where I want to highlight my images and colors. So I've die cut the section that I want. To adhere it down, I'm going to use some foam tape, and this is a huge roll of it. I haven't used these foam tapes in such a long time because I've been using more 3D foam squares, but this was a lot more convenient for covering the back of this panel. So I pulled that out, and then I'll go back to my 3D foam squares for the smaller images. After adhering that sunflower center with the 3D foam square, I'm just curling the petals underneath it around that center so that I can add it to the second layer of petals. That way there's a good shape to the sunflower and gives it a little bit more dimension. Now before I adhere it down, I'm going to go ahead and set it aside and work on my sentiment first because I want to make sure that I get the placement just right for the sentiment and the flowers to work around the sentiment. So I'm stamping and embossing some vellum with the sentiment that I'm using and embossing it with gold embossing powder so that it coordinates with the lines in the background. And then for this little frame, I'm going to die cut it with matte gold cardstock, and it's a very fine frame, so I'm being very careful not to apply too much glue that will cause it to ooze out all of the sides and also to keep its shape. And then to adhere it to the card, I'm going to be using really thin strips of foam that I'm going to be cutting from a large 3D foam square. I'm placing a few of those strips behind the frame as well as a few smaller tiny strips behind the larger letters on the word pumpkin. Then I'll adhere that to the center of the frame and then add my sunflower and foliage to go around that frame. That larger piece of foliage that I'm about to adhere down is a little bit too big. I didn't want the leaf to cover up the frame in any way. So I'm going to cut off that leaf at the top there and then use it to tuck under the sunflower on the other side in the corner. And then that finishes my card for today. I hope you enjoyed this project and seeing how I use these fun Nuvo Shimmer powders. And what you don't see in pictures is the shimmer in these shimmer powders. So I hope you got a good look at that just now. If you're interested in any of the supplies that I use, be sure to check out the links below. Everything will be linked for your convenience. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.